Owen left the office the moment the clock said 5, because all day long a terrible tiredness had weighed down upon him. Something on the way, he thought. Flew. He stumbled off the bus and around the corner to the dark red door of his flat. Bookies on one side, a boarded-up shop that used to sell TVs and now sold nothing, on the other. He laboured up the stairs and slumped on his worn couch. I never expected this, he thought. After 23 years of marriage, I never expected to be on my own, in a flat like this, sweating and shivering, and with nobody here to make tea or sympathetic noises. He shook his head. Stop it. When he moved out, he promised himself that he was not going to descend into self-pity. He was scared that, if he did, he might never be able to climb out again. He opened up his laptop, reluctant to go to bed, because if he did, his day was just bed, work, bed, and no room in it for anything resembling a life. Owen skimmed the transfer gossip first, then the tragedies that competed for headline space, and then carelessly, almost as if by accident, he clicked on a link to a website where you could zoom in on a map until it was as if you were standing there in the street. It opened with the map focused on his flat. He zoomed into Street View and looked at his dark red door, defaced with black graffiti so old that it couldn't be read anymore, sandwiched between posters of horses on one side and boarded-up windows on the other. A blur shadowed the edge of the picture, as if someone was just about to walk into shot. He hesitated for a moment, and then typed in the address that was the real reason he kept this website bookmarked. Owen sat for a while, looking at the house that used to be his. Used to be theirs. The car was in the drive, his car, not the other car that it turned out had been there a lot of the time when he was not. He could see cards on the downstairs windowsill. There were so many, it must have been the week of her birthday. Her birthday, because he never got that many cards. Most of those were for people he knew through her, and after it all went wrong, he didn't hear from them either. "Stop being so sad," he said in the end, and swore that he would never do this again, just like he swore every other time. Stop it. He clicked back, from the life he'd once had to the life he had now, the dull red door. Just on the edge of the photo was the figure of a man on the pavement, his face blurred. Owen hadn't noticed him before, but something about him was familiar, something about the Mac that he wore, about the set of his shoulders. Owen rubbed his eyes, closed the laptop, and then fell asleep on the couch. He woke with a start, as if someone had just spoken his name. His mouth was so dry he could hardly swallow, and his head throbbed and pulsed like he was in the grip of the worst hangover of his life. He stumbled to his feet, but had to grab for the arm of the couch, dizzy, as if the floor was spinning away from under him. He staggered into his bedroom, shed his clothes on the floor like the skin of a snake, and collapsed onto the bed and into a fevered sleep where he dreamt that he was dropping forever down through the mattress in an endless fall. In the morning, when he got ready for work, it was like he was watching someone else do it. He slumped in a corner of the back seat on the bus, massaging his jaw because it hurt, as if he'd been grinding his teeth all night. The world slid by, unnoticed, and he nearly missed his stop. By the time he reached his desk, he was clammy with sweat. Owen opened files and spreadsheets and stared at them. The letters and numbers a foreign alphabet he couldn't understand. No one seemed to notice that he looked unwell, or if they did, they chose not to say, lost in their own private struggles to get through another day. By lunchtime, he couldn't stand it any more, and he lurched into Keith's office. "Yeah?" said Keith, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "I'm sorry," Owen said. "I've got to go home. I'm sorry, I feel terrible." Keith looked up then, not doing much to hide his annoyance. "Where you up to on fixing the billing problem?" "I've done what I can," Owen said, and thought, what if I hadn't? "It's with Denise now. Till she comes back to me, there's nothing else I can do, and she's in Manchester until Thursday." Keith nodded a grudging acceptance, and dropped his gaze again. Dismissed. On his way home, Owen leaned his head against the dirty window of the bus, because at least it was cool. He shivered, hours awake in hot, wet sheets that coiled tight around him, and when he couldn't stand not sleeping any more, he stumbled into his small front room. He couldn't take any more paracetamol for another hour, but he took some anyway, and then took some more on top as well, because his head hurt very much. The world was close around him, the walls of his flat pressing in, and everything was very still and quiet, as if something important was just about to happen. He switched the TV on, but everything was too loud, too bright, so he switched it off again. I've had flu before, he thought, but never felt like this. He thought of calling a doctor, but changed his mind. He would be so embarrassed to be told that it was just the flu, and he should take plenty of hot drinks and sweat it out. Should he sweat it out? Or stay cool? Call the doctor after all? Owen didn't know, and wished so much that there was someone there who could tell him, who could bring him a cool drink, someone who could just be there. Owen swayed over to the kitchen table, opened up his laptop. He would look up some advice on the internet, and if he didn't feel better by tomorrow, then he would call the doctor. When his screen lit up, it still showed the photo of his street he'd been looking at the evening before. Owen wiped his hand over his mouth, peered closer at the figure standing on the pavement, close to the door of his flat. The face seemed less blurred than it had yesterday, almost in focus. The way the man stood, the square take-no-prisoners set of the shoulders. Owen shook his head, then winced, because that made him feel dizzy and sick. He opened up a new window and typed his symptoms into the search box. 2 minutes later he gave up, because he couldn't focus on the words any more. He took a breath, and then another, because the first was very difficult. Doctor, he thought. Got to be doctor. He closed the NHS web page, and it no longer hid the picture of his street. The blood beat in his ears like a tribal drum. He looked at the screen, at the figure standing right at the door to the flat, the figure in its dark mac, well-shined shoes, the familiar set of the shoulders, the face not blurred at all. Owen staggered down the stairs, nearly falling twice, but he somehow made it to the bottom and crashed out through the front door into the street, an empty street, and he looked around him, and the world spun around him, and the world pushed in on him, and he said, "Dad," and he fell to the floor, and he said, "Dad," again, in a plaintive voice, and then darkness stole in from the edges of the world and took everything that ever was. The policeman had to go up to the flat to see what was what, even though he hated that part of his job. He saw too many sad, untidy flats where a man had lived alone and died alone, and he was scared that this was how his own life might end. But he had to go up, so he did. The flat was as functional as most of the others that he saw, and tidier than many, but he could feel the stale air of long, lonely hours weighing down on him. There was no evidence of anything that might have had a bearing on the death, no signs of struggle, no empty vodka bottles. A laptop glowed open on the kitchen table. The policeman looked closer, saw a browser open at a view of the street outside. The dark red colour of the flat's door, marked with black graffiti so old it couldn't be read any more, and just walking out of shot, 2 men, very close together on the pavement, their faces blurred.